The faint scent of old books and melted wax lingered in the quiet chamber behind the coastal chapel, where Sophie stood silently before a misted mirror. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the ivory cotton wedding dress, each stitch tenderly sewn by her grandmother, who had poured her heart into it before passing away. The dress was modest, with no gems or lace, but to Sophie it was sacred, a final fragment of brighter days. Through the narrow, stained glass window, morning sunlight streamed in, casting a soft glow over the emerald hills beyond. Seagulls cried faintly in the distance, as if to reassure her, to whisper that everything would be okay, even though she knew a storm of judgment waited just outside. Today, Sophie would marry Nathan, the once revered young billionaire now confined to a wheelchair and the scorn of the public. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady the storm of emotion rising in her chest, in her heart. This marriage wasn't just a cold agreement. It was a quiet promise, a secret she had never spoken, not even to herself. Nathan sat in a sleek, customized wheelchair, his tailored charcoal suit unable to hide his paralyzed legs. His features were defined, his gray eyes deep like stormy skies, vast but hollow, as if every emotion had been drained from him. The day tragedy struck 2 years ago, the day he lost his cherished older sister and his ability to walk, left behind only silence. But behind that cold exterior lay a meticulous plan. As stated in his late father's will, Nathan had to marry before turning 31 to maintain control over the family empire and his role as CEO. If not, all assets would be transferred to Anthony, a cousin with a polished smile and insatiable ambition. Nathan had no desire for love anymore. He didn't want to trust again, but he needed a wife, someone who wouldn't interfere with the fortress he had built around himself. Sophie was ideal, a humble girl from a coastal town with no powerful family, no personal agenda, and most importantly, she had signed the contract. 3 years as his wife in name only. No intrusion into each other's lives. A generous financial reward at the end. Nathan had only met her once before the wedding, in a sterile legal office where she signed the documents with trembling hands, but a firm gaze. He never questioned why she agreed. He didn't care. To Nathan, this was strictly business. But when Sophie began walking down the aisle, her old flats brushing quietly against the flower-strewn floor, Nathan felt something unfamiliar flicker within him. She was unlike any woman he had known. No vanity, no show. Her posture was steady, her auburn hair tied neatly, and her eyes, calm, pure, held no greed, no cunning. She looked at him, and only him, as if the world had disappeared. The chapel was full, yet the air felt thick with curiosity and venomous whispers. "She's marrying him for the money, obviously," a woman in a pearl necklace sneered. "The crippled billionaire and the gold digger. What a joke." Another man snorted. "She'll run the moment she gets the chance. Mark my words." Outside, reporters jostled for space, camera flashes bursting like fireworks, ready to turn the ceremony into a tabloid circus. Wedding or greed-fueled farce. Sophie walked slowly but steadily. She could feel the invisible daggers of judgment piercing her with every glance. But she didn't falter. A distant memory swept in. The first time she had read about Nathan, the young man who had built homes for orphaned children, who turned away fame to focus on silent acts of kindness. She had followed his story from afar, watching his journey unfold in headlines. And when news of his accident came, her heart shattered. She cried alone in her cramped, rented apartment, not out of pity, but for the loss of a brilliant soul, dimmed by tragedy. Now standing in front of him, she understood that she hadn't simply signed a contract. She had made a vow to remain by his side, even if the whole world stood against them. That hidden love she had locked inside her chest, too afraid to reveal, fearing it could one day destroy her, was now all she had. The elderly priest, his voice warm and unwavering, began the vows. "Sophie, do you take this man to be your husband, in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty?" Sophie looked at Nathan, her eyes gentle but resolute. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent chapel. Only she knew that her answer meant more than ceremony. It was her heart making a quiet promise, to stand beside the man she had secretly loved for years, even if he never discovered the truth. Laughter erupted from the back pews, cruel and sharp like pins pricking through her dignity. A photographer's flash flared, blinding her momentarily. Sophie blinked, then reached out, her hand gently grasping Nathan's. She gave it a light squeeze. His hand was ice cold, unmoving in his lap, giving her nothing in return. But she didn't let go. She needed him to know that no matter how far he tried to push her away, she would remain. After the ceremony, once the guests had gone, Sophie stood alone by the window, watching the rolling hills bathed in the amber glow of sunset. The scent of dry grass and coastal earth calmed her, but the weight in her chest remained. She never expected a wedding of laughter and flowers, but Nathan's silence made her feel more alone than ever. She wondered if he would ever open up to her, or if she'd always be nothing more than a placeholder in his carefully constructed world. Nathan was still there, in the far corner of the room, slowly wheeling back and forth. He watched her from a distance. His gaze unreadable, Sophie turned and offered a soft smile, trying to mask the ache within. "Today is our wedding day, Nathan," she said gently. "Aren't you going to say anything to me?" He didn't respond immediately. His eyes swept over her, then drifted out to the hills beyond. "You don't have to try," he said, his voice low and cold. "This is just a transaction, you know that." And with that, he turned his wheelchair and rolled away, the soft creak of the wheels echoing on the wooden floor. Sophie remained still, her heart twisting in pain. His words cut deep, but as she looked out at the rolling green hills touched by the late sun, her gaze hardened with quiet resolve. In that silence, something shifted in her. Beneath the ache, a stubborn fire stirred, fueled by love, not pride. She had walked into this knowing the walls would be high, but also knowing she wouldn't leave without trying to tear them down. Nathan didn't need a savior. He needed someone who would stay, even when it was cold, even when it hurt. She would prove she hadn't married him for money or convenience. She had married him because her heart had chosen him long ago, and she would dedicate herself to making him believe it, someday. The wedding was over, but Sophie's journey was only beginning. Within her, a small flame continued to flicker, fragile but steadfast. She knew the path ahead would be hard and lonely, but she was ready, for Nathan, for the love she kept hidden, and for herself. The story was just beginning. Nathan's estate stood on the edge of a cliffside, surrounded by towering pine trees, their thick branches casting long shadows like ancient sentries guarding a forgotten world. It resembled a piece of classical art, weathered stone walls streaked with moss, towering arched windows, and perfectly groomed rose gardens blooming in deep scarlet. But inside, the air was frigid and lifeless. The polished marble floors gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers. Priceless paintings lined the walls, yet nothing could fill the emptiness that seemed to stretch across every room. Sophie felt it the moment she entered, as though joy had long ago vanished, leaving only silence behind. Nathan treated her like a phantom, someone meant only to fulfill the bare essentials. "Bring me a glass of water," he said, his tone flat, his eyes glued to the book in his lap, though she knew he wasn't truly reading. "Close the door," he added without even glancing up. To Nathan, Sophie was nothing but a name on a contract, an obligation that allowed him to retain control of his family fortune and CEO title. The terms were straightforward. She would remain his wife on paper for 3 years, and in return she'd receive a generous payout, so long as she remained the picture-perfect spouse. Quiet, compliant, and never crossing the boundaries of his private world. He believed she had come for the money, and he had no intention of letting her pass the glass fortress surrounding his heart. But Sophie wasn't shaken by his icy demeanor. In silence, she cared for him the same way she once cared for the tiny flower bed outside her childhood cottage. Patiently, gently, and without asking for anything in return. Each task became her quiet ritual. Wiping the dust off forgotten shelves, folding his blankets with hands that trembled some days with exhaustion, yet never faltered. Her hope was not loud, but constant, like a soft hum in her chest that refused to die out. Each morning she tidied his spacious room, arranging books she knew he wouldn't touch. She cooked modest meals, pumpkin soup, warm toasted bread, and left them on the dining table, adding a wildflower from the garden each time, hoping the color might soften the loneliness that lived in the air. She sat beside his window, reading aloud from old novels in a soft, calm voice, though often he would interrupt with a curt, "That's enough. Go back to your room." Sophie never complained. She understood that Nathan's coldness wasn't hatred, it was armor forged from old wounds. She saw it in the way his hands clenched when anyone mentioned the past. In the distant, hollow look in his eyes when he stared out the tall windows toward the hills. And she believed, deep down, that the man she once admired still lived inside. The man who donated millions to children's homes, whose smile once lit up newspaper pages she had carefully clipped and saved in an old notebook. One afternoon, as soft golden sunlight filtered through the linen curtains, Sophie finally did something she'd long wanted to do. She knelt beside Nathan and gently placed her hands on his unresponsive legs, beginning to massage them with slow, deliberate care. "What are you doing?" he snapped, his voice tight. His hands gripped the chair's armrests as he shoved her back. "Stop. I don't need that." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes steady, calm. "The doctor said it might help with your nerve sensitivity," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Please, just let me try. Just once." Nathan stared at her, his gaze cold as glass, as if trying to read through her. But he said nothing more. Eventually, he turned his head away, letting her continue. Sophie worked in silence, her hands moving with care, as if trying to pass some of her warmth into him. She didn't expect gratitude. But when she rose, she noticed his hands had loosened from the armrests. A small shift, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. That evening, sitting beside him, Sophie began sharing a childhood memory. "When I was little, I used to run into the wildflower fields behind our cottage," she said, her voice light as wind. "Whenever I felt sad, I'd sit there and stare at the clouds. It always made me feel like things would be okay." She paused, then asked, "Do you have a place like that, Nathan? Somewhere that makes you feel safe?" Usually he wouldn't answer, or he'd mutter for her to stop talking so much. But tonight, though his eyes stayed fixed on the opposite wall, Sophie noticed the slight loosening in his posture, his shoulders a little less tense. She didn't press. She simply smiled and returned to reading. She knew reaching him would take time, and she was willing to wait. One night, as a storm raged outside, thunder rattling the window frames, Sophie bolted upright in bed at the sound of a low, distressed moan. Her heart pounding, she threw on a robe and hurried down the dark hallway. Bursting through the door, she found Nathan lying in bed, drenched in sweat, his hands tightly gripping the sheets. "James, don't go," he murmured in his sleep, his voice cracking with pain. "Don't leave me, please." Sophie stood frozen, her heart aching. James, Nathan's older brother, the one who had died in the accident that left Nathan paralyzed. She remembered the article vividly, reading it alone in her tiny rental apartment, tears slipping down her cheeks. She hadn't known Nathan back then, but she had cried for him, for the man who had once been a light in so many lives, now swallowed by darkness. That night her heart had broken for a stranger. Now that stranger was her husband, and every tremble in his voice cut into her like a knife. And now, watching him suffer even in sleep, that pain felt like her own. She sat beside his bed, gently wiping the sweat from his brow. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. She whispered soothing words, not to wake him, but as if speaking might calm the ghosts haunting his dreams. Her touch was featherlight, reverent, as if easing sorrow from skin to skin. She stayed with him quietly, until the groaning faded and the storm outside began to settle. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, she stood and left a small note on his pillow. Her handwriting was soft but steady. "If someone tries to make you fall, I'll be the one who helps you stand." The next morning, when Sophie walked in with his breakfast tray, she saw Nathan holding the note. His eyes lingered on her words. He said nothing, but for the first time, he didn't push her away. "You don't have to do all this," he said, his voice low, no longer as cold. "The contract doesn't require you to care." Sophie smiled gently as she placed the tray down. "I'm not doing it because of the contract," she replied, her eyes glowing with quiet warmth. "I'm doing it because I want to." Nathan looked at her, his expression unreadable, as if trying to find something buried in her words. He didn't respond, but as she turned to leave, she heard him exhale softly, a quiet breath, yet enough to tell her that the glass wall between them had started to fracture. Back in her room, Sophie sat by the window, watching the oak-covered hills still draped in morning mist. Inside her, the small flame continued to burn, fragile but unwavering. She knew the road ahead would be long, that Nathan wouldn't let his heart open easily, that the world would still whisper and mock, but she wasn't afraid. Because the roots of her love were deep, anchored not in fantasy, but in a truth she had carried alone for years. Because she believed, no matter how strong that wall was, she would find a way to reach his heart. Not for money, not for the agreement, but for the secret love she had carried inside her for so long. Morning sunlight poured through the wooden blinds of the mansion's library, casting golden slats across towering bookshelves coated in time-worn dust. Sophie stood at the center of the vast room, her fingers brushing gently over the spines of aged, leather-bound books. But her mind wasn't on them. For weeks now, an uneasiness had stirred in her, like a quiet shadow. As if something in the house, or in Nathan's past, was trying to remain hidden. She had begun noticing the subtle signs. The way staff members avoided her gaze, how conversations abruptly halted whenever she entered a room. And most of all, Anthony, Nathan's cousin, his fake smile, that razor-sharp gaze that unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. That day, while looking for a botany book to help tend her flower garden, Sophie accidentally discovered a hidden drawer in an old mahogany desk. Inside was an aged medical file, the paper brittle and yellowed, bearing Nathan's name. Her heart pounded as she opened it, but curiosity quickly shifted into suspicion. Several key pages, especially those detailing Nathan's condition after the crash, had been torn out, leaving behind rough, jagged edges. She skimmed through what remained and found mention of a single witness, a mechanic named Derek, who had inspected Nathan's car before the accident. But when she asked the butler about him, he responded curtly, "He moved overseas right after. No one knows where he went." Sophie clutched the file tighter, unease weighing heavy on her chest. She didn't believe in coincidences. The crash had taken Nathan's brother and left Nathan in a wheelchair. But why were vital details missing? And why did Anthony, with all his polished charm and perfect manners, give off such an unsettling presence? She returned the file to its place, resolved to quietly investigate, no matter what secrets Nathan's family wanted buried. Life at the mansion continued, but the air seemed to thicken with every passing day. Nathan still kept his distance from Sophie, but the frost in his tone had slightly thawed. He no longer barked commands, and every so often she caught him watching her a little too long, as if trying to read her mind. Sophie continued caring for him with quiet resolve, massaging his lifeless legs, reading to him by lamplight. She shared stories of her childhood, memories of chasing butterflies barefoot through wildflower fields, hoping to stir a glimmer of warmth inside him. Nathan rarely replied, but he no longer silenced her like he used to. Small signs, but to her, they meant he was beginning to let her in, if only just a little. Everything changed, however, at a dinner party hosted at the mansion. The event was meant to impress a key business partner. Sophie hadn't wanted to attend. She knew she didn't belong in a world of glittering dresses and imported champagne. But Nathan had insisted. "You're my wife," he said, his voice flat but firm. "They need to see that." Sophie had nodded, pulling her auburn hair into a neat twist and slipping into a plain blue dress. She entered the grand ballroom with a heavy heart. The room sparkled under crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly, their melodies floating through the air. But beneath the polished marble and flowing wine, tension coiled tightly. Anthony stood among the guests, wine glass in hand, his counterfeit smile stretching wider when he spotted her. Once everyone had gathered, he lifted his glass and raised his voice. "I'd like to make a toast to Sophie," he announced. The girl who turned fantasy into fact, a humble country wife, and a crippled billionaire. What a match made in heaven, wouldn't you say? Laughter erupted around the room, harsh, brittle, like glass shattering across stone. A few guests tried to stifle their laughter behind polite hands, but their eyes betrayed nothing but disdain. Sophie stood frozen, her hands clenched around the fabric of her dress, as though the weight of the entire room bore down on her shoulders. She wasn't someone who broke easily. But those words, and the silence that followed, cut deep, like knives slashing through her dignity. The polished glamour of the ballroom blurred around her, as if the chandeliers themselves had turned into harsh spotlights, exposing her deepest vulnerabilities. Her chest tightened, each heartbeat echoing louder in her ears than the laughter around her. She looked toward Nathan, seated alone in his wheelchair at the far end of the hall, silently hoping, pleading that he would say something, anything, to defend her. But he only lowered his head, eyes fixed on the floor, his hands gripping the chair's armrests as if trying to contain something within. Sophie smiled, though her heart ached with quiet agony. She would not let them see her falter. "Thank you, Anthony," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "I'm proud to stand beside Nathan, no matter what the world thinks." With that, she turned and left the ballroom, not waiting for her tears to betray her. That night, Sophie retreated to the greenhouse tucked behind the garden, the one place that brought her solace. Moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, casting silver reflections on dewy petals. She sat quietly on a wooden bench, arms wrapped tightly around herself, letting her tears fall in silence. The cool air kissed her skin, but it couldn't numb the sting of humiliation. In that moment, surrounded by delicate blooms, she allowed herself to crumble, if only in the privacy of moonlight and glass. The next morning, as Sophie tended to her flower pots, she heard the hum of wheels on gravel. She looked up, startled, to see Nathan maneuvering his wheelchair down the path toward her, on his own. The early sun touched his face, outlining his sharp features, though exhaustion lingered in his eyes. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze meeting hers. Not cold, not guarded, just searching. "Last night," he said quietly, his tone low and hesitant, "I didn't laugh. I don't think like they do." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "But I saw them. And I saw you. You stayed." Sophie looked at him, warmth blooming in her chest. She knelt down to meet his gaze, offering a tender smile. "I'll always stay, Nathan," she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes glowing with a love she had never dared speak aloud. "No matter what they say, no matter what you believe about me, I'm here." Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked at her, as though trying to decide whether her words were real. Then slowly, he gave a small nod and turned his wheelchair to leave. But as he exited the greenhouse, Sophie noticed something. For the first time, he hadn't turned away from her with that usual cold distance. Sophie stood in the old garage of the mansion, where flickering fluorescent lights cast ghostly shadows over vintage cars hidden beneath dust-covered tarps. The scent of old motor oil and rusted metal lingered thick in the air, making her wrinkle her nose. But she didn't lose focus. Ever since she found the medical file with the torn pages in the library, suspicion about Nathan's accident had clung to her like fog. Every time she gently brought it up with household staff, she was met with sidelong glances and vague replies. "That's all in the past, Miss Sophie," the butler had murmured, his voice unsteady. "Please don't reopen Mr. Nathan's wounds." But Sophie's instincts, honed by years of surviving hardship in her coastal village, told her something wasn't right. She had been watching Anthony, Nathan's cousin, the one who smiled too perfectly, but whose gaze was sharper than steel. He always interrupted whenever the crash was mentioned. There were the late-night phone calls, the overly personal involvement in Nathan's affairs. All of it made her uneasy. She remembered what the butler had said about Derek, the lone mechanic linked to the crash, how he had supposedly moved abroad right after. Too convenient. In a corner of the garage, Sophie found an old wooden box, its carvings worn by time. Inside was a disorganized stack of receipts, invoices, and old notes. One repair slip made her breath catch. It was dated one day before Nathan's accident. Derek's signature was at the bottom, along with a handwritten note. "Brake inspection, per special request. Ensure no trace left." Attached was a small, hastily written note. "Thank you, Anthony. It's done." In the corner of the receipt, it read clearly, "Paid by Mr. Harrington." Harrington, Anthony's last name. Sophie's heart pounded. Why had Anthony paid for Nathan's car repairs? Why had the mechanic ensured no trace was left after checking the brakes? She gripped the paper tightly, fear and fury twisting inside her. She took photos of everything and sent them to Mr. Henry, an independent lawyer she trusted. "Please find out if Derek really moved overseas," she wrote, fingers trembling but tone resolute, "and investigate what Anthony did to that car." She knew she was stepping into something dangerous, but she couldn't remain silent. Not to prove anything to Nathan, but because he deserved the truth. The truth about what had taken James and his ability to walk. Back in the greenhouse, her sanctuary, Sophie sat quietly, clutching the folder of documents to her chest. Her heart was heavy with uncertainty. Nathan had trusted Anthony deeply. They had grown up together, almost like brothers. To confront Nathan with these suspicions might not only shatter that bond, but undo the fragile trust she had just begun to build with him. But staying silent would be a betrayal of everything she believed in. After hours of agonizing, Sophie made her choice. She would tell Nathan, not to force him to believe her, but to give him the chance to see the truth himself. She carefully returned the papers to the box, took the photos and the note, and drew a deep breath. Then she walked toward Nathan's study. He was seated in the reading room, the warm light of sunset pouring through tall windows, casting golden edges along the weary lines of his face. A book lay open on the table in front of him, untouched. Sophie stepped into the room, her hand tightly gripping the photograph. Her heart pounded, though her gaze remained steady. "Nathan," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I need to talk to you about the accident. I found something, and I think it might be connected to Anthony." Nathan's brow tightened. His fingers curled around the arms of his wheelchair, his eyes narrowing with a flash of anger. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his tone sharp and cold. "You're making things up just to get closer to me. Anthony is family. You really think I'd believe you, someone who's only here because of a contract over him?" His words cut like cold steel. But Sophie didn't flinch. She placed the photo of the receipt and the attached note on the table before him. Her voice remained calm but firm. "This is the repair invoice for your car, the day before the crash," she said. "It says the brakes were inspected under a special request, no trace left. Anthony paid for it. And this," she tapped the note, "is from Derek. It confirms the job was done." "Nathan, I don't want to believe Anthony did this either, but I can't ignore what I found." Nathan stared at the papers, and for the first time Sophie saw his hands tremble. He clenched the table's edge, his knuckles turning white. The room seemed to shrink around him, memories of the crash pressing in like walls. The metallic screech, the helplessness, James's scream, it all rushed back with unbearable clarity. His eyes locked onto the words M. Harrington in Derek's scribbled message, then slowly lifted Sophie's face, searching for any sign she might be lying. "Anthony was the only one there for me," he said hoarsely. "After the accident, he worked with the police, handled everything. They ruled it brake failure, no foul play. And now you want me to believe he betrayed me?" Sophie knelt in front of him, bringing herself to his eye level. Her gaze was gentle, yet steady. "I know you trust Anthony," she said softly, "and I don't want to hurt you, but I asked everyone in the house about the accident, and they all dodged it. Then I found these. Nathan, even if there's the slightest chance the crash wasn't an accident, you deserve to know. Let me keep looking. I'm not asking you to believe me right now. Just give the truth a chance." Nathan looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. He remembered those long days in the hospital, Anthony sitting at his side, assuring him everything was being taken care of. He also remembered how quickly Anthony had taken control of the story. He had convinced him it was fate. But now, each line on the document seemed to whisper a different story. A betrayal wrapped in loyalty. But now, these papers, though not definitive, had planted something dangerous in Nathan's mind. Doubt. He was a CEO, trained to calculate risks, assess evidence, and now he couldn't ignore what Sophie had brought. At last, he gave a slow nod. His voice was rough, strained. "I'll have it investigated. Ethan, an old friend of mine, he'll handle it," Nathan said, his voice low but certain. "You can keep looking too, but be careful. If you're right, I need to know." He paused, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer. "But if you're wrong, Sophie, I won't forgive you." Sophie smiled, even though her chest ached with the weight of his words. "I hope I'm wrong," she replied, her voice glowing with conviction. As she turned to leave, his hand brushed gently against hers, an almost unconscious gesture, but it told her enough. Something had shifted. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but another small crack had formed in the glass wall between them. That night, Nathan sat alone, the documents still scattered across the table in front of him. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Ethan," he said, his tone quiet but steady, "I need you to investigate the accident from 2 years ago. Find Derek, the mechanic. Look into Anthony's involvement. And don't tell anyone, not even Sophie. He didn't want her drawn deeper into something that might be dangerous, not when the truth was still so uncertain. In his mind, the crash returned in broken flashes, the screech of metal, James's scream, then darkness. For 2 years he had believed it was fate, punishment. But now, Sophie's findings, her voice, those documents, they forced him to consider something far more devastating. That the man he called family might have been the one who betrayed him. The next morning, when Sophie brought breakfast into his room, Nathan looked up. His eyes weren't cold anymore. "You've stirred something I can't ignore now," he said, voice low. "Be careful, Sophie. If you're right, there are people who won't want you digging further." Sophie smiled, her eyes calm and resolute. "I know," she said, "but I won't stop. Not for me, for you." As she turned to go, she didn't see the way Nathan watched her leave, his eyes holding something new. Respect. And maybe, just maybe, the first flicker of hope he thought he had lost forever. Dawn slowly melted through the mist, casting golden light across the oak-covered hills. In a small training room tucked behind the mansion, the chirping of sparrows outside the window blended with Nathan's labored breaths. He sat on a therapy bench, hands gripping parallel bars. His legs, long dormant, now trembled as they tried to hold his weight. Across from him stood Sophie, quiet but steady, her eyes glowing with belief, arms ready to catch him if he fell. This was their 3rd day of secret therapy sessions. A decision Nathan had made after suspicions about the accident began to surface. And after seeing Sophie's relentless faith in him, he didn't want anyone else to know. No staff, no doctors, just him and Sophie, in this small room where he could confront his fears without judgment. The decision to try hadn't come easily. But after allowing Sophie to investigate and reaching out to Ethan, Nathan felt something begin to awaken inside him. He had lived in darkness for 2 years, convinced that both his body and soul had been shattered in the crash. But Sophie, with her unwavering gaze, her care that endured despite his coldness, made Nathan begin to wonder. Could he reclaim a piece of himself? Not the man who once led a corporation, but someone no longer shackled by pain and guilt? "You can do this," Sophie said gently, yet with quiet strength, as Nathan tried to lift his left foot forward. She knelt beside him, correcting his posture with light but steady hands. "Just take it slow, Nathan. Even one step is a victory." Nathan didn't reply, but his eyes met hers, no longer sharp or defensive. He focused. Sweat dripped down his forehead, every movement a brutal clash of body and will. When his foot touched the floor, however briefly, Sophie's face lit up in a radiant smile, as though she were watching a child take their first steps. "See?" she whispered, her eyes shining. "You did it." Nathan exhaled, still gripping the bars with trembling hands. But at the corners of his lips, the faintest curve formed, a small, unintentional smile. It was barely there, but it cracked through the layers of ice that had encased his heart for so long. A flicker of warmth in a place he had believed frozen forever. It was the first time Sophie had seen him smile since the wedding. Faint as it was, it made her heart race. She didn't say a word, just helped him back into the wheelchair and gently wiped the sweat from his brow with a towel. In that moment, the space between them vanished, leaving only shared silence and a quiet, growing hope. Every morning they returned to the training room. Just the two of them. Sophie became Nathan's hands, his eyes, his strength. She learned to read every signal in his body, when he needed rest, when he wanted to push harder, when he was battling himself. She never forced him, but never left his side. Always patient, always gentle. Nathan began to change. His glances lingered longer, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as if trying to understand why she stayed, why she believed in him, when he had long stopped believing in himself. Each session stripped away a layer of bitterness, a sliver of fear, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable, but no longer afraid to hope. One morning, when Nathan stumbled, Sophie quickly caught him, her arms wrapping around his waist to steady him. They stood close, breaths mingling. And for the first time, Nathan didn't pull away. He looked into her eyes, deep, searching, then gently squeezed her hand. A small gesture. But Sophie felt it deeply. "Thank you," he murmured, the words pushing through walls just to be spoken. Sophie smiled, her heart glowing. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "I'm here because I want to be." She didn't say out loud what filled her heart, but her warm, radiant eyes said it for her. One day, While cleaning out one of Nathan's old rooms, Sophie discovered a leather-bound journal tucked behind a dusty bookshelf. The name James was written across the cover, Nathan's older brother, the one who had died in the crash. Her heartbeat quickened as she opened it. The handwriting was bold, but full of feeling. She skimmed the pages, and the final entries stopped her cold. Her breath caught. Nathan never wanted to be CEO. He just wanted freedom, to live simply and help others. But Father and I pushed him. I was wrong to force him into that chair. Sophie clutched the journal, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She pictured James, whom Nathan had always spoken of with so much sorrow, carrying this guilt until the very end. She knew Nathan needed to read these words, not just to understand James, but to finally forgive himself. And yet, she hesitated, afraid that unveiling the truth might reopen wounds too deep to heal. That evening, after their training session, she brought the journal to Nathan's room. He was seated by the window, moonlight casting a soft glow over his face, illuminating not just his fatigue, but something else, something gentler, a flicker of light. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "I found this. It belonged to James." Nathan's hand trembled as he touched the leather cover. He opened the journal and began to read. When he reached the final page, his eyes turned red. Tears fell. Not in sleep, not in secret, but awake, fully feeling. "James died because of me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to be CEO, but he and Father pushed me. If I hadn't gotten in that car, he'd still be here." Sophie sat beside him and gently took his hand, gripping it tightly. "Nathan, you're not broken," she said, her voice strong, yet tender. "James didn't want you to carry this guilt. He wanted you to be free, to be happy. And I'm here, not just because I believe you can walk again, but because I believe you can rise again, with your heart." Nathan looked at her, his gaze lingering. You're not like anyone else, Sophie," he murmured. She smiled, her heart racing. And in his eyes she saw another fracture, wider, deeper, in the wall that had always stood between them. Nathan held her gaze, eyes still wet with grief, but glowing now with something more. Understanding. He didn't speak, but his hands tightened around hers, as if clinging to her was the only way to keep from slipping back into the darkness. In that moment, Sophie felt it, a connection beyond trust, something invisible but real, quietly drawing them closer. If this story found you beyond the gates of Soul Stories, we invite you home, to the place where every tale begins with truth, hope, and heart. The dim light of the mansion's study cast a pale glow across Anthony's face. His signature fake smile never wavered, but his eyes, cold and sharp like a serpent's, didn't lie. Sophie stood before him, hands clenched tightly, heart pounding, but her gaze was steady, unflinching. She had been summoned to the study late at night, after a staff member had accidentally let it slip that Anthony knew she was investigating Nathan's accident. The secretive glances, the hushed phone call she overheard, the sudden tension in his voice every time she mentioned Derek, the mechanic. All of it had confirmed what Sophie feared most. Anthony was hiding something, and he'd do whatever it took to keep it buried. "Sophie," Anthony said, his voice low, silky, but with an edge of menace. "Who do you think you are? Some amateur detective? A hero?" He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "You're digging into things that don't concern you." He smiled coldly. "Take my advice. Stop now. If you play smart, things don't have to get unpleasant." A chill ran down Sophie's spine, but she refused to let the fear show. She had already sent the repair receipt and Derek's note to Mr. Henry, the independent lawyer she trusted. She knew she was close to uncovering the truth. "I'm not afraid of you, Anthony," she said, calm but unwavering. "Nathan deserves to know what really happened, and I won't stop, no matter what you do." Anthony stepped closer, his smile twisting into something darker. "You're more stubborn than I thought," he whispered. "But remember this, Sophie, accidents can happen. You'd better think carefully, for your sake, and for Nathan's." He held her in a long, piercing stare, a silent threat, heavy in the air. Sophie turned and walked out of the study, her hands trembling, but her head held high. His warning had been like a knife to her throat, but she wouldn't stop, not for pride, for Nathan. The man she had quietly loved for so long, who was finally learning to rise from the wreckage, and who, she now knew with certainty, was surrounded by betrayal. Meanwhile, Nathan wasn't sitting idly by. After entrusting the investigation to Ethan, a former security officer and longtime friend, he received a preliminary report on a cold morning. The email was short, but it made his pulse race. Suspicious financial transfers traced from Anthony's account to a shell company before the accident. Derek confirmed to have received funds from that company before disappearing. Further verification needed, but Anthony may be involved. Nathan read the message again and again. Each word sliced deeper into the trust he had once placed in his cousin. Anthony, the man who had stood by him through the darkest days, who handled the police, who comforted him after James's death. Could he really be the one behind it all? Nathan's hands clenched into fists, suppressing the rage and grief boiling in his chest. The seed of doubt had grown. He didn't tell Sophie, not yet. Not until there was solid proof. He wouldn't let her fall deeper into danger. But each time he looked at her, those bright, believing eyes, that soft smile as she supported him in therapy, he felt an urge to protect her. Not just because she was helping him, but because of something more, something deeper, something he still didn't dare to name. Sophie continued her investigation, more cautious than ever. Mr. Henry had just located a potential lead. Derek might be living under a new name in a small town, several hundred miles away. Sophie avoided direct confrontation with Anthony, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Every creaking floorboard, every sideways glance from a staff member, it all put her on edge. Still, she pressed on. She knew the truth about the crash was the key to giving Nathan justice, and she refused to give up. One afternoon, Sophie drove the old mansion car toward the mountain town where Mr. Henry's contact awaited with more information about Derek. The winding roads were flanked by dense forests, and the cold air seeped through the car's thin windows. Focused on the drive, she glanced into the rearview mirror, and her stomach dropped. A black car had appeared behind her, keeping its distance, never overtaking. Even when she slowed down, her heart pounded. A chill traced her spine. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale as her mind raced with possibilities. Was it just coincidence, or was someone truly following her? She pressed the gas, trying to pull ahead, but as she rounded a sharp curve, the tires lost grip. Metal shrieked. The car veered off the road and slammed into a massive oak tree. Her head struck the steering wheel. Blood trickled down her forehead, and darkness swallowed her whole. Nathan was in the training room, struggling to take another step between the parallel bars, when the butler burst in, panic written all over his face. "Mr. Nathan, Miss Sophie, she's been in an accident." The words pierced through Nathan like a dagger. He nearly fell from his wheelchair, fists clenched around the arms, breath ragged. "Where is she?" he shouted, voice cracking. "Tell me where." When they brought him to the crash site, Nathan saw the mangled car pinned against the tree, and Sophie, motionless on a stretcher. Blood streaked her forehead. His heart felt like it had stopped. The past came rushing back. The metal scream, James's voice, the darkness that took everything. He had relived it 1,000 times. If I hadn't let James drive, if I'd been behind the wheel instead, he had blamed himself endlessly. Now, staring at Sophie unconscious, a new, horrifying thought consumed him. Fate was repeating itself. The people he loved, James, now Sophie, were being taken from him, one by one, as if by some cruel curse. "Sophie?" he cried out, slamming his fists against the chair. Tears and sweat mixing on his face. "She can't die. Do you hear me? She can't." His voice cracked, no longer cold, no longer controlled. In that instant, everything within him fractured. Rage, sorrow, helplessness all surged forward, shattering the walls he had spent years building around his heart. Panic devoured him. And through it all, one question echoed in his mind. Was Anthony behind this too? Ethan's report. The suspicious payments. The role Anthony played in the first crash. If Anthony had harmed him before, could he now be trying to silence Sophie? The thought made Nathan tremble, with fury, and with fear. The dim hospital lights cast a pale glow across Sophie's face, highlighting the bruises and the bandage wrapped around her head. She lay on the bed, her breathing shallow but steady, eyes half closed, as if lost in a fragile dream. Beside her, Nathan sat motionless, his hand gripping hers so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His eyes were bloodshot, veins prominent from the strain. He hadn't slept since the moment she was rushed in after the horrific accident. The room was silent, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. But inside Nathan, A storm was raging. He couldn't erase the image of the crumpled car at the base of the tree. The blood on Sophie's forehead. The moment he thought he'd lost her, just like James. As if fate was determined to rip away everyone he dared to love. That fear, tangled with guilt, and the new evidence from Ethan about Anthony's role in the crash 2 years ago, stripped away the last remnants of his cold, detached mask. Sophie had changed him. Little by little, with her patience, her courage, her quiet light. And now, seeing her lying there, alive but fragile, he realized a painful truth. He didn't just need her. He was learning to love her. Sophie stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, blinking against the soft hospital light. Her body ached everywhere, but the first thing she saw was Nathan, his hollow face, his red-rimmed eyes, and the way he held her hand, like he was afraid she might disappear. "Nathan," she whispered. Her voice was weak but warm. He leaned in closer, as if he had to see her awake to believe it. "Sophie," he said, his voice rough and trembling. "Don't ever scare me like that again. You can't let something like this happen. Do you understand?" Tears slid down his cheeks, and for the first time Sophie saw him vulnerable. Not physically, but emotionally, his heart unshielded, exposed. She gave a faint smile, despite the pain. "I promise," she whispered, her eyes steady and filled with quiet strength. She tried to sit up, wincing with each movement. Nathan quickly helped her, his hands careful, steady, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Even when she was upright, he didn't let go. His gaze stayed locked on her, filled with pain and something even deeper, something he had never shown her before. "Sophie," he began, his voice low and trembling, as if every word had to break through a wall inside him. "I married you for the inheritance, for the CEO position. It was all a plan, cold, calculated, no emotion. I thought you were the same, here for the money, for the contract." He paused, drawing in a shaky breath, his eyes searching hers as if trying to reach her soul. "But now, I'm terrified of losing you. When I saw you lying there unconscious, I thought I couldn't survive it. Not again. Not like I lost James. I don't want to live in a world where you're not in it." His confession washed over Sophie, like warmth through ice, soothing wounds she had hidden for so long. She looked at him, her eyes soft but fierce. "Nathan," she said, her voice gentle but sure, "I didn't marry you just because of the contract. I've loved you for a long time, long before you even knew me. I saw you, the man who built homes for orphans, who turned down the spotlight to do quiet, meaningful work. I watched you share meals with those children, carry them in your arms. I admired you. And when I heard about the accident, I cried alone, not because I pitied you, but because I mourned a brilliant soul swallowed by darkness." She paused, tears slipping down her cheeks. But she didn't look away. "I'm here because I want to be here, with you. Whether you're a billionaire in a wheelchair or just Nathan, the man learning how to rise again." Her voice wavered slightly, but her conviction never faltered. Every word was a piece of her heart laid bare, no longer hidden behind silence or duty. Nathan looked at her, as if pulled into each word, drawn to a sincerity he'd never dared to believe in. He had built a glass wall around his heart, but now it was cracking under her light. "You love me?" he whispered, voice unsteady. "Why? I'm not that man anymore. I'm just someone who lives with guilt and shadows." Sophie shook her head, and though her hands trembled, she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into her embrace. "You're not broken, Nathan," she said, voice shaking with emotion but steady. "Your heart is still here, and it's stronger than you know. I love you, not for who you were, but for who you are right now, the man who's trying, fighting, standing again. I'm here because I believe in you, and I'm not leaving." Her arms tightened around him, as if shielding him from every ghost that still clung to his soul. The tremble in his shoulders told her he was finally letting go, just a little, of the weight he had carried alone for too long. Nathan let her hold him, his arms slowly wrapped around her, tight, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to this world. He breathed in her warmth, the soft scent of her hair, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to feel something more than pain. He leaned down, his lips found hers, and they kissed. The kiss was gentle, but full of fire, like a promise, like a river washing away years of pain, doubt, and distance. It wasn't just love, it was healing. It was light, slipping through the fractures of two hearts that had been broken too long. When they finally pulled apart, breath mingling, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. Eyes closed, tears falling silently. "I don't know if I deserve you," he whispered, his voice shaking. "But I want to try to become the man you believe in." Sophie smiled, her hand gently brushing his cheek, wiping away his tears. "You don't have to deserve me," she said. "You just have to be here with me," she said softly. "That's enough." In the days that followed, Sophie slowly recovered, but Nathan never left her side. He sat by her bed, telling her stories about growing up with James, the dreams he once had before being forced into the CEO chair. For the first time, he shared Ethan's report, suspicious transactions connected to Anthony, signs that Anthony might have been behind not only his own accident, but Sophie's too. Every word he spoke felt like a blade slicing into the truth they were trying to protect. Love, trust, and caution all tangled in her eyes. Sophie squeezed his hand tightly, trying to steady his soul and anchor him to her. "I don't want to believe Anthony did it," he said quietly, "but I will find the truth, and if he laid a hand on you, he'll pay." Sophie took his hand, her gaze steady. "We'll find the truth, Nathan," she said. "Together." She didn't say it aloud, but in her heart, she knew. Their love, still new but fierce, would be the strength that carried them through whatever came next. Morning sunlight filtered through the ancient oak trees, casting golden rays over the Harrington Corporation headquarters, where decisions shaping an empire were made. Nathan stood before the mirror in his bedroom, hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his tie. The black suit hugged his frame, concealing months of pain and scars that ran deeper than flesh. He now needed only a light cane for support, a testament to a grueling recovery. With Sophie as the light that led him through it, he drew in a deep breath before stepping out, the weight of everything pressing down on him, yet his gaze stayed resolute. She stood behind him, heart pounding as the door closed behind them, knowing the storm they were about to face. Today, he would walk into the boardroom, not as the ghost of a fallen CEO, but as a man who had reclaimed himself, ready to face the one who had betrayed him and taken from him the person he loved most. Sophie stood behind him, her eyes bright with belief but shadowed with worry. "Are you okay, Nathan?" she asked gently. "Anthony won't make this easy." Nathan turned to her, his gaze soft but resolute. "I'm ready," he said quietly. "For you, for James, for the truth." He reached out, brushing her cheek. A small, intimate gesture that made Sophie's heart skip a beat. His fingers brushed her skin like time stood still. Two people, stripped of titles and expectations, meeting only as souls tangled in love and fear. She took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, grounding him before the storm. The boardroom felt suffocating, despite its luxurious design. The board members sat around the long table, eyes darting between tension and curiosity. At the head stood Anthony, dressed in a sleek gray suit, the smugness on his face barely veiled behind professionalism. He was in the middle of presenting his plan to assume the CEO role. His voice was smooth, but filled with ambition. "Nathan is no longer fit to lead," Anthony said. His gaze swept the room like a predator. "I propose we transfer executive power today, for the good of the company." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the room, but before he could continue, the doors burst open. Nathan stepped inside. Each step was slow, but deliberate. His cane tapped lightly against the marble floor. The room fell silent, all eyes locked on him, the man they never expected to see standing again, now upright, sharp-eyed, unwavering. Sophie followed behind, calm but fierce, a silent warrior by his side. Anthony froze, the smug smile disappeared. Nathan didn't speak right away. He stopped in the center of the room, eyes locked on Anthony. His voice was steady as he finally broke the silence. "I'm not here to negotiate, Anthony," he said. "I'm here to finish what you started 2 years ago." He nodded to Sophie, who stepped forward and inserted a USB drive into the projector. The screen lit up. First, security footage recovered by Ethan, Anthony speaking to Derek beside Nathan's car the day before the crash. Then came the damning documents, a signed repair receipt with Anthony's name, Derek's notes, detailing special requests to the brakes, financial transfers from Anthony's account to a shell company that paid Derek, and finally, an audio recording. Derek's voice, his confession. Anthony had hired him to sabotage the brakes. The room held its breath. Anthony jumped to his feet, panic breaking across his face. "This is fake," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Nathan. "You staged all of this to ruin me. You always had everything, Nathan. Your career, your father, James. I didn't mean to hurt James. I was targeting you." His voice cracked, rage and fear mingling beneath every word. He took the wheel himself. It wasn't supposed to be him. Nathan stood still. Pain flickered in his eyes at the mention of James. He took a step closer, his voice low but cutting. "Tell me why, Anthony," he said. "Tell me why you betrayed me. Why you betrayed him." Anthony let out a dry, bitter laugh, his composure crumbling. "You don't get it, Nathan," he snapped, voice trembling with hatred. "I was always in your shadow. Your father raised me, but he only ever saw you. James loved me, but he always chose you." I smiled. I played nice, but inside, I was screaming. "Why did you get everything? The career, the love, the family, and I got nothing?" His fists clenched as if trying to hold back years of resentment, twisting, festering, finally spilling into the light. "All I ever wanted was the CEO position. Just once, to stand above you. I paid Derek to sabotage the car, so you wouldn't take over the company. But James, he wasn't supposed to die. He got in the car, not you. I never meant for that to happen." Nathan's grip tightened around his cane. Tears welled in his eyes, but his voice didn't waver. "My father loved you like a son. James protected you. He always said we were brothers, the three of us. And I saw you as my brother too. But you chose betrayal. You didn't just hurt me, Anthony. You killed James. And you nearly took Sophie from me." Anthony backed away, panic overtaking him. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I had no choice. I did what I had to." But the excuses sounded hollow now, like echoes in an empty hall, void of remorse or redemption. His words were cut off as the doors opened again. 2 security officers stepped inside, followed by a police detective. Ethan had handed over the evidence. Anthony was out of options. As the officers moved to arrest him, he snarled one last time at Nathan. "You'll never win, Nathan," he hissed. His voice, once sharp with arrogance, now trembled with fear. But Nathan didn't flinch. He simply stood there, calm, resolute, a man who had walked through darkness and finally stood in the light. He hissed. But Nathan didn't flinch. He simply watched, calm and resolute, like a man who had walked through darkness and finally stood in the light. When the room was empty, only Nathan and Sophie remained. He turned to her, eyes brimming with emotion. "Sophie," he said softly, "you saved me. In a way no doctor, no stretch of time ever could. Your heart, your belief in me." Sophie smiled through her tears. She stepped forward, resting her hand gently on his chest, feeling the strength of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "You saved yourself, Nathan," she whispered. "I only reminded you that you could." He leaned in, forehead pressing lightly to hers, his hand tilting, her chin up with tenderness. "I won't promise you the world," he murmured, "but I will spend my world loving you, protecting you. Always." A year had passed. Gentle spring sunlight draped itself over the fields of towering oaks, the same ones that had once witnessed Nathan and Sophie's darkest days. The villa atop the hill no longer felt like a tomb. The rose bushes Sophie had planted were in full bloom. Laughter from children at the nearby rehabilitation center drifted on the breeze, carrying with it life and hope. Nathan stood in the center's courtyard, no longer needing a cane, no longer bound to a wheelchair. His steps were strong and sure, pressing into the soft grass below, each one a quiet declaration of victory. He had fully recovered, not just physically, but emotionally. And it was all because of Sophie, the woman who had pulled him out of the shadows. He had returned as the CEO of Carter Enterprises, but he was no longer the man who once sat in that chair out of duty or inheritance. Now he led with a new vision, driving the company to unprecedented heights. Always placing people before profit, he expanded charitable programs, built homes for orphans, funded scholarships for disadvantaged youth, and most importantly, with Sophie by his side, he founded the Light Center, a sanctuary for the disabled and the homeless, a place where people could rediscover their value and the will to rise again, just as he had. Sophie was the heart of the center. She ran it with tireless devotion, organizing therapy sessions, offering emotional support to those facing their own battles. She never sought attention, but every smile she brought to a face was reward enough. Nathan often watched her from afar, a quiet awe blooming in his chest. She wasn't just his wife, she was his beacon, the reason he stood where he did today. One early morning, the center echoed with laughter during a special walking class for children with disabilities. Nathan knelt beside a boy, just 8 years old, helping him take his first steps with tiny crutches. "You can do it," Nathan said warmly, his voice steady and calm. "One step at a time." The boy beamed up at him, and when his foot landed and held, a cheer rose around them. From beneath a sprawling oak nearby, Sophie watched, dressed simply in a white blouse, her brown hair tied up. She saw Nathan, her Nathan, not the CEO, not the man who had healed, but the man who was now giving back. The very hope he had once struggled to find. Tears ran quietly down Sophie's cheeks, not from sadness, but from pure, full-hearted joy. They had risen from ruin together, from the mocking whispers at their wedding, from the storm of doubt and grief, from Marcus's betrayal, and that terrible crash. Now, they weren't just husband and wife, they were two souls who had healed one another. Nathan looked up and found her gaze. He smiled, a gentle, familiar smile that she had come to love more than anything. He gave a small nod to a nearby staff member and began walking toward her. Every step steady, every motion a silent declaration of everything he had overcome. When he reached her, he took her hand and led her under the oak's canopy, where golden light filtered through the leaves in soft, flickering patches. "Sophie," he said, his voice low, trembling with emotion. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever stand again. I didn't think I'd ever find myself again. But you changed everything. You didn't just help me walk. You taught me how to live, how to love, how to believe in good things again." He paused, drawing in a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. "I used to think I didn't deserve you, but now I know. I want to spend the rest of my life proving that maybe, just maybe, I can." Sophie felt her heart pound as Nathan knelt before her, still holding her hand. From his pocket, he drew a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring, its surface gleaming in the sunlight. "Sophie," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "You married me once, for a contract, for faith. Now I'm asking you to marry me again, for love, for our future. Will you be my wife again?" Tears spilled freely down Sophie's cheeks, but her smile outshone them all. She knelt down with him, arms circling his shoulders, head resting against his. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy, "I married you because I loved you, and I would marry you 1,000 times more, because you are my whole world." They embraced beneath the oak tree as cheers and applause rose from the center behind them. Nathan gently slid the ring onto her finger, his hand slightly shaking but sure. He leaned in and kissed her. A kiss soft yet fierce, a promise that whatever storms life might bring, they would always have each other. That night, Nathan and Sophie sat together on a wooden bench outside the center. Moonlight brushed their faces in silver, and the ring on her finger sparkled like a quiet vow. "I can't promise life will always be easy," he said gently, voice warm, "but I promise I'll always be here with you, the way you were always there for me." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, smiling peacefully. "That's all I've ever needed," she whispered, and they sat together in the quiet of the night, knowing that no matter how painful the past had been, they had found each other, and together they had stood up from the ashes to build a future full of light. So the story is over. Our dear, wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you are, then maybe, just maybe, something in this journey has stirred your heart. Maybe it was Sophie's quiet strength, or Nathan's rise from despair. Maybe it was love, imperfect, hard-won, and healing that kept you reading. Whatever it was, thank you for walking this path with us. This story wasn't just about contracts and power, or even betrayal and redemption. It was about the unseen battles we all fight, the loneliness that doesn't show, the wounds that don't bleed, and the love that quietly saves us in the moments we least expect. Nathan's journey taught us that healing doesn't come from time alone. It comes from courage. The courage to trust, to stand again, to believe you are more than what broke you. And Sophie reminded us that sometimes loving someone means believing in them when they no longer believe in themselves. As Rumi once said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. And that light doesn't always roar. It often comes gently, in the form of someone who simply stays. So if you've ever felt like you're too broken, too lost, or too far gone, let this be your reminder. Your story isn't over. Healing is real, and you are worthy of love that doesn't walk away. We'd love to hear what touched you most, so please, like, share, and subscribe if you found meaning in this story. Your support helps us continue creating stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, keep believing in quiet miracles, in the power of second chances, and most of all, in yourself. We're so grateful you stayed with us until the end. This may be the last page of the story, but maybe for you, it's the first page of something beautiful.